Liberal democracy is on the brink. That's the conclusion from the data guru at the Financial Times this week, who says the old system worked under a set of conditions that are no longer present. The conditions that existed when liberal democracies flourished were economic growth and growing working age populations. Both have stalled or gone into reverse. That's according to this argument. And John Byrne Murdoch says this: democratic backsliding, the advance of populists, and the breakdown of the liberal world order have all tracked a clear economic and demographic slowdown. Viewed through this lens, the political and geopolitical turmoil of the past decade is not an aberration or a series of special cases, but the new normal. And this is the chart he uses to show the historical relationship, or at least correlation, between liberal democracy and economic growth rate. So this is looking just at high-income countries. The red line shows annual growth rates. The blue line shows the average scores among rich countries on a liberal democracy index. That's obviously sort of a somewhat artificial construct, which measures the extent of voting rights, freedom of expression, and executive constraints. As you can see, they track each other quite closely. So in the years after the Second World War, there was a very high growth and liberal democracy flourished. Since the 2000s, growth has slowed and liberal democracy has gone into retreat. So it's probably more likely those countries where freedom of the press or freedom of association has been undermined, because there aren't many sort of things which are sort of clearly democracies that have become where people don't vote anymore. It's more that sort of liberalism. The liberal elements of liberal democracy are in decline. So what might be the relationship? Obviously, we know correlation is not causation, but should there be a mechanism that would connect these two phenomenons? John Byrne Murdoch writes this. Research finds that key underpinnings of liberal democratic societies, such as trust and cooperation between different communities and nations, are fostered by rising prosperity. It creates optimism and serves as proof for core ideals, such as the belief that we all gain if we put the greater good and long-term thinking ahead of narrow self-interest and short-termism. Economic growth also helps reduce ethnic and other intergroup tensions, increasing trust by weakening the sense of fighting over a fixed pool of resources. The new low-growth world of zero-sum competition and aging populations is fundamentally different, and it follows that it will have fundamentally different politics. Stagnation breeds a politics of impatience, self-interest, hostility towards outgroups, and a smash-the-system disregard for norms and institutions that were centuries in the making. Helena, I want your view on this. I suppose in the degrowth argument, which often sort of arises, my position is always that on a global level, absolutely not. We need growth. There are still many poor people in the world. India needs rapid growth. Most of Africa needs rapid growth. China could still do with some more growth. In the West, I'm sort of agnostic. I think, probably we could all have a good enough standard of living if we distributed a bit more. But the argument I find very strong against degrowth, even in the rich countries, is that democracy struggles when we're not growing. Do you think that democracy can survive a world with very low growth rates?
There's lots of questions to this. So I'm always going to be skeptical of any analysis that looks at two trends and then tries to infer causation from correlation. I think it's a really important caveat. I do think that there is plenty of good logic that he's presented, however, to make that link. Well, what is interesting between those two graphs is that the growth trails the liberal democracy index. It does seem to me that whilst there is some level of a correlation, it does seem to me that liberal democracy is the platform to create that growth, right? So there's something there, I think, that is worth looking into to see. I think it is important to understand that, sure, those kind of zero-sum thoughts about fixed pools of resources has been the historical norm through human history, especially developing human history, right? Imperialism has always been fighting over resources, and being able to use growth, which is essentially all from a thing called total factor productivity, i.e. being able to make more things with the same amount of labour and capital, has been the bedrock on which the innovation that's come from liberal democracy has been able to improve living standards without having to fight over scarce resources, whilst having a framework there to ensure that there is some kind of non-corrupt way of being able to ensure that people understand the framework with which they're bargaining for the resources that exist. And if that breaks down, there's a problem. The issues that I have with the analysis, though, is that there have been plenty of non-liberal democratic societies You look at, for example, I'm a bit of a Yugo boost. I'm going to talk about socialist Yugoslavia again, which is that they had significant levels of growth during this period, which John Berg Murdoch points out in this graph, where you link the Liberal Democracy Index and high growth rates, right? And it was indeed after a collapse in growth where you started to see more levels of social distrust, more levels of zero-sum thought, which ended in the Yugoslav wars and fighting between perceived national interests of the constituent nations. But they weren't a liberal democracy. They were a socialist dictatorship, right? I thought a pretty trusting socialist dictatorship, very well-functioning one, as far as I can see. But it was still that lack of growth that led to a societal breakdown. But there are other examples where you look at America. Cale Moran from Unlearn Economics made a really important point about the idea that growth would be the end of the lack of growth would be the capitulation of European politics, and saying, well, look at America. Even in a post-2008 world, they've been having really good growth. In fact, they're one of the only kind of major Western economies that's had very high growth. Has that solved their political problems? Has that reduced the levels of zero-sum thinking? Has that created more societal unity? Arguably, no. Arguably, their internal political problems are worse than they are in plenty of Western European countries. I would say arguably significantly worse than they are in the United Kingdom, despite the fact probably we're more unequal, especially regionally, than the United States is. So is it going to be a panacea to gain that economic growth? Well, the example of the United States would say no. But actually, there is something more that's afoot here. And I think the problem that we have is that liberalism has therefore created neoliberalism. It's been born out of it. And even in a world of growth, when all of the proceeds of that growth is going into the pockets of very, very few people, there's not the guardrails and the redistribution of the embedded liberalism of the post-war period, this kind of zero-sum politics is inevitable, whether you have a liberal democracy or not. And of course, there's plenty of geopolitics happening that's going to be breaking down the system that previously had at least some kind of rudimentary set of rules to decide who has access to what resources, even if it was heavily slanted towards the global north because of imperialism and the way in which it was set up by the United States in their interests in the first place. So there's lots of questions about this, but clearly we have to be worried about what's going to happen if these kind of mindsets that I think the argument that have been created somewhat by low growth have embedded in societies, and how we combat that. How do we get, if growth is necessary, how do we get it in a world with vanishing productivity growth? Or if it can fight it without economic growth, how do we do that? Lots of questions.
Yeah, I suppose I just think there are so many explanations, it's difficult to pass them apart, isn't it? I think clearly liberal democracy is easier with growth because distributional concerns, you can, I suppose like New Labour is an example, right? Because they had high growth rates, they could redistribute to poorer people without having a big row with business. And that sort of meant that it all could kind of tick along quite nicely. Even in sort of the social democracies in the post-war period, where there was a lot more class consciousness and class war, there was a compromise that could be reached between the capitalists and the workers because growth meant that there was just more to share all the time. Now you've got a lot more conflict. And yeah, that could sort of come out in class conflict, which I think would probably be healthy to some degree. It's also coming out in ethnic conflict, which is less healthy, I think. I do think social media is probably as big an issue as growth. I mean, it's difficult to pass the two. I've got this graphic. Can we get this graphic up? So it's public trust in government in the United States. And as you can see, so it's really high in the 1960s, where you did have high growth, but also, everyone watched the same two TV channels and read newspapers, which were written by people who were very cozy with elites in Washington. Then it goes down. You have the Vietnam War, you have Watergate. It goes up again a bit when Reagan is quite popular and there's high levels of growth. Goes down under Bush. Do you have a little recession there? I'm not quite sure. Then obviously you got like strong growth rates under Clinton, so it goes up. He's quite popular. Peaks at 9/11, goes down sort of under Bush, so you can sort of, that's when the war in Iraq sort of flops. And then it sort of reaches 20%. And then the thing that stands out from you there is not that it's not that it's lower than it's ever been, because it was sort of low in the mid-90s as well. But it's that it cannot get off that base. So it does seem like whatever happens, it stays at about 20%. And obviously, between 2008 and now, growth has been slow compared to previous eras. But in America, at least, it's picked up at times, it's gone down at times. And I just think that with everyone looking at their own social media feed, I feel like even if things got quite good, people would still just be super negative about it. And that you can probably never have a period where more than 20% of people like their government now.
Well, I buy that argument, but I think what's interesting to me, it seems to be a really big correlation between the advent of social media and the 2008 financial crisis, right? And obviously, the really kind of big ticking time bomb of these
They
two
happen
kind
at
of
the
big
same time, which is
revolutions.
really annoying for social science.
It's so true, because, the fact that all of the boom growth that happened in the 90s and the early 2000s was essentially built off the fumes of the financial sector that exploded in 2008. No one was punished for this, right? One thing that I think that creates social unity, regardless of what your system looks like, whether you're a liberal or not, whether you're a democracy or not, whatever it is the feeling that there's a social contract at play there. And 2008 blew that apart. It absolutely annihilated the idea that there was a social contract, that people had some level of responsibility. And the fact that in lots of Western nations outside of, basically just Iceland, I guess, bankers got away scot-free. They were bailed out by the government. No one was properly punished for this. The people who bore the brunt of most of these problems were normal people fighting amongst themselves, whether you're blaming minorities or whatever it is, whether it's migrants that are the issues for the post-2008 kind of stagnation in living standards for ordinary people. Because whether there was growth, right, that was all sucked up by the super rich. It was sucked up by, the kind of the new oligarchs in a post-2008 era. And social media or not, that level of discord that was directed towards outgroups is reminiscent of a time pre-social media to me. But the fact that even if there is growth, it's not going to the people. It's not going to the people who do the work. And they don't see the work that they do to keep society going is being remunerated adequately in the way that it was pre-2008. But the people who were solely responsible for the destruction of huge amounts of what was gained pre-2008, not being punished or held to account and bailed out. A social contract breaking down in that way is very difficult to be able to recover, and will lead to people thinking, well, if there's nothing that I'm getting out from putting in, I have to go inward. I have to protect my thing. I have to be inward facing rather than outward facing, because what did outward facing politics get me when the people who were supposed to be the ones stewarding the economy didn't help me and didn't help the people who I care about at a time when the economy was in collapse?
I think I think they should have jailed some bankers, absolutely, and I think that should have been used as a political opportunity by the likes of Gordon Brown and even Barack Obama to say, let's move away from this rentier-based system and have a whole new economy. They should have done that. But I think I'm not really convinced by the idea that people remember what happened in 2008 to the extent that they'll never regain their trust. I think it's more structural than that. And I suppose why I think it not budging since 2008 is what's relevant there, because there have been loads of periods in sort of modern history where people have sort of been outraged at something the government has done. So looking at America, you've got Watergate, you've got the Vietnam War, a couple other things, and then sort of trust plummets. But then it recovers as people sort of forget and they look around and they say, like, oh, actually, maybe things are working again. And I don't think that the reason people don't have trust now is because of something they remember in 2008 or 2010. I think it's like there is something about the structure of our society now, which means everyone hates the government.
Well, I think the thing that
everywhere.
I think the thing that people hate is the structure that led to 2008. It may not be specifically the bankers that they remember, right? But it's a society where there are no rules for oligarchs and there are rules for everybody else, which is essentially the parable.
But if you ask them about issues, like, yeah, some of them would say that. Lots of them say immigration. There's all sorts of issues that people would say, but everyone's just a bit angrier now about everything.
That's true. But I think the zero-sum thought is a byproduct of an economic base that has not been able to turn economic growth into better proceeds for working class people, and they don't feel like. Because not only do they not have remuneration from the social contract that they've paid into, where's the sense of purpose in this kind of world either? That's one thing I think that's causing a lot of mental health problems as well, which is part and parcel of this societal breakdown, is that people don't have a vocational sense of purpose when that social contract isn't fulfilled. Like, if you're not going to work to be able to create something for yourself, if all you're doing is, delivering food for Uber Eats or whatever it is does that give you purpose in life? And again, without that leading to something like a stable life or a family or being able to afford a house or being able to go on holiday or run a car, which a lot of these people can't afford, that's a superstructure of a bigger problem with which the people, again, even if there was no growth, they could still be kind of living standards there'd be living standards that would be, whilst they'd be stagnant, they wouldn't be dropping, is what I'm saying, right? And that's there's a differential between what was previous, where we did get access to those things, ordinary people did, and now we don't.
Yeah, I suppose we're going to wrap up now. I agree with a lot of what you've said. I suppose because the rejection of sort of like trust in government is so widespread. Like, if it were about homeownership, if it were about sort of young people can't buy houses, then what you'd expect is older homeowners to have confidence in the government and younger non-homeowners to not have confidence. If it was about purpose, yeah, there are lots of people doing jobs that don't have purpose. There are also lots of people doing jobs that do have purpose, and they also hate the government.
That's true.
So it's sort of like, if you've got a house or you don't have a house, you hate the government. If you've got a really meaningful job or not a meaningful job, you hate the government. So it's sort of, it doesn't seem to me like it can be about one of those things, because whether or not you got the home, whether or not you got the good job, you hate the government, which is why I feel like I think it's social media.